Life stories often have unexpected twists, teaching us the importance of love, trust, and resilience in the face of adversity. In today's story, we follow Julia, a successful pharmacist, as she navigates the challenges of being married into a wealthy family that rejects her for her background. From family exclusion to a shocking attempt to poison her, Julia's journey is one of courage and self-discovery. Join us as we dive into her emotional battle and the profound lessons learned along the way. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's life story. As the evening sky in St. Louis began to darken, Julia Bennett quickly made her way out of the bustling St. Louis University Hospital. It had been another grueling day, filled with long hours spent in the pharmacy, counseling patients, and managing the constant flow of prescriptions. Julia was exhausted, but there was a familiar warmth in her chest as she thought about the one person who made her life worth living, Michael Hamilton. Her husband. She reached into the pocket of her white lab coat and pulled out her phone. Checking the time, there was a message from Michael. "I'll be a little late today. The research is at a critical stage. Love you." Julia smiled softly, replying quickly, "Take your time. I'll be waiting." She could feel the weight of the day's work begin to lift as she typed the message. Her thoughts drifted to Michael, to the way he had entered her life like a breath of fresh air, turning everything upside down in the best possible way. The two had met 8 years ago, at a scientific conference where Michael, a researcher at a prestigious pharmaceutical company, had been one of the keynote speakers. Julia had admired his sharp intellect and quiet confidence, but it was his kindness, his sincerity, that had drawn her in. Their love blossomed quickly. Julia, raised in a middle-class family in a small town, had always been driven, determined to build a future in the sciences. She had earned her scholarship to pharmacy school and was now working as a trusted pharmacist at the university hospital, living a life she had worked hard to create. But it was only after meeting Michael that she truly felt as though something was missing in her life, and that something had been him. There was, however, one shadow that hovered over their happiness: Michael's family. Julia had always known that marrying into the Hamilton family would not be easy. His family came from old money, with a legacy steeped in privilege and social status. Helen, Michael's mother, had made it clear from the beginning that she did not approve of Julia. She believed that Michael should have married someone of equal standing, someone from a more prominent family, perhaps someone with a name that carried weight in society. Julia had long since come to terms with the fact that she would never fully win Helen's approval. But what hurt the most was the way Helen had treated her: cold, dismissive, always finding ways to make Julia feel like an outsider. And then there was Emily, Michael's sister. Emily had always sided with her mother, displaying the same disdain for Julia. The two had made it clear from the start that Julia was not the person they had envisioned for their brother and son. The subtle insults, the exclusion from family gatherings, the cold glares, all of it had been a constant presence in Julia's life. Yet, she had always swallowed her pride, keeping her peace for Michael's sake. He had spoken to his family on her behalf, reprimanding them when their behavior became too obvious. But in his heart, he believed that over time, they would come to understand and accept Julia. It was the night before Emily's wedding when the tension reached a boiling point. Julia had been excluded from the rehearsal dinner. Helen had made it very clear that she wanted to keep the event, just for family. And when Julia received a phone call from her mother-in-law, she knew exactly what it was about. "Julia," Helen's voice was as cold as ever, "I wanted to let you know that we'd prefer you not attend the rehearsal dinner the day after tomorrow. We'd like to keep it just for family." The words stung, but Julia held her composure. She took a deep breath before responding, "I understand." As she ended the call, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She knew that she would never be welcomed into the Hamilton family. But for Michael, she had learned to endure their coldness, to swallow her pride and continue to love him unconditionally. She understood why he never confronted his mother and sister more aggressively. They were his family. And he hoped that with time, they would come to accept her. But deep down, Julia knew that it was never going to happen. They would never accept her because of who she was. She was an outsider, an upstart, in their eyes. And that reality hurt more than she let on. Later that evening, when Julia arrived home, she noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter. It was a wedding invitation. The kind that exuded wealth and sophistication. The picture on the front featured Emily and her fiancé, Thomas Bradshaw, the son of another well-established family. Julia turned it over and noticed a sticky note on the back. Written in Michael's neat handwriting. Mom came to deliver this in person. She asked about you, but I told her you were at work. Love you. Julia sighed, staring at the invitation. She had become all too familiar with this type of exclusion. Her place in Michael's family had always been at the edges. Never fully part of their world. No matter how much she tried to fit in. But what choice did she have? She loved Michael, and she would never let her relationship with his family drive a wedge between them. As Julia sat on the couch, her mind raced. She had begun to notice some odd things about Helen's behavior recently. As a pharmacist, Julia had a sharp eye for details, and there were certain things that had started to raise her suspicions. Helen's recent shopping habits, particularly the herbs and chemicals she had been purchasing, didn't sit right with her. There had been a time when Julia had caught a glimpse of the contents of Helen's shopping bag. And her professional instincts had immediately gone on alert. But there was no way to prove anything. At least not yet. Julia would have to remain vigilant. To trust her instincts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. And so, as the night wore on, Julia found herself preparing for what would surely be a challenging week ahead. She had a sinking feeling that Emily's wedding would be the turning point, the moment when everything would unravel. Little did she know, that feeling was about to become her harsh reality. The day of Emily's wedding arrived, and Julia felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. From the moment she woke up, she had been uneasy. The nerves were there, but it wasn't just about the wedding itself, it was about what might happen at the reception. About the subtle threats she had begun to sense. Julia had become more attuned to her mother-in-law's behavior, and her instincts told her something was off. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the pleat of her dress for the third time that morning. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, and she took in a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering anxiety in her chest. Michael was beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek, his voice warm and comforting. "Let's enjoy today. It's important for Emily." Julia smiled at him, trying her best to suppress her growing sense of dread. "For you," she thought, looking into his eyes. She had promised herself she would be strong, that she would support him in every way. But the unease remained. Her mind kept circling back to Helen and Emily, and the strange feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. They arrived at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, the most prestigious venue in St. Louis. The grand entrance was adorned with sophisticated floral arrangements, and guests in tuxedos and extravagant gowns moved through the lobby, chatting amongst themselves. Michael opened the car door for Julia, extending his hand to help her out. She took a deep breath and, with a firm nod, accepted his hand, trying to steady her nerves. As they entered the venue, all eyes momentarily turned toward them. Julia could feel the whispers start as they walked in. She straightened her back, lifting her chin and walking with as much dignity as she could muster. At the reception, the staff checked their names, and when their seats were revealed, Julia's stomach sank. It was the furthest seat from the main table, the most distant corner of the venue. Julia frowned, glancing at Michael, who had also noticed the odd arrangement. "Is there some mistake?" she asked, trying to remain calm. The staff member hesitated for a moment before replying. "These are Mrs. Hamilton's instructions. She specifically requested this seating arrangement." Michael's face darkened with visible anger, but he suppressed it. "I understand," he said quietly. "It's Emily's wedding. I don't want to make a scene." Julia felt the sting of exclusion, but she kept her composure, forcing a smile. For Michael, she thought, she had been through enough with this family to let it affect her now. As they walked to their assigned seats, Helen appeared, dressed in an elegant silk gown. Her eyes quickly scanned Julia's outfit, her lips curling into a cold smile. "Julia," Helen said with a frosty tone, "I see you managed to dress properly today." She looked Julia up and down, her gaze dripping with disdain. "It has a common taste. But I suppose you did your best for today." Julia's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you. It looks like it will be a lovely ceremony." Helen's laugh was light and dismissive. "Yes, a ceremony worthy of the Hamilton family tradition," she replied, her words dripping with sarcasm. Then, turning to Michael, she added, "The main table will seat Emily's friends. So your seats are separate. Please respect Emily's wishes." Michael's jaw tightened, and he opened his mouth to protest. But Julia gently squeezed his arm. She smiled and nodded at Helen. "I understand," she said calmly, despite the burning anger rising inside her. As they settled into their seats at the farthest corner of the venue, Julia did her best to ignore the hurtful remarks she overheard from nearby guests. The wedding ceremony began with great pomp. Emily walked down the aisle in her elegant white gown, and Thomas Bradshaw, her well-groomed fiancé, greeted her with gentlemanly grace. As they exchanged vows, Julia couldn't help but notice the occasional triumphant glances from Helen and Emily directed at her. The reception followed, and Julia's senses remained heightened. Champagne was served, and the young waiter who approached their table was quick to offer the drinks. As he placed a glass in front of Julia, she immediately sensed something off. The scent of the champagne was subtly different, not quite like the usual crisp fragrance she was familiar with. Julia leaned in slightly, inspecting the glass. She noticed a faint difference in the color, though it was barely perceptible. Her heart raced. This wasn't right. Trusting her instincts, Julia gently set the glass down, hesitating before she even touched it. Michael, noticing her unease, asked, "What's wrong?" "The scent is strange," Julia said quietly, her voice laced with concern. She didn't want to alarm him, but she could feel the tension building inside her. Michael sighed, his expression softening. "You're overthinking it again. You worry too much about my mother," he said, trying to reassure her. "Look, there's nothing wrong." Julia glanced at the glass again, her unease deepening. "Maybe it's just my imagination," she thought, but something told her to be careful. She didn't want to cause a scene, so she tried to smile and push the feeling away. But when Michael picked up her glass and took a sip, Julia's heart skipped a beat. Across the table, Helen's face drained of color. Her eyes widened in panic as she jumped from her seat. "Wait, don't drink that," she shouted, her voice cracking. The entire room fell silent. Michael looked at his mother, confused. "What's wrong?" Helen stammered, her face pale. That's, well." Michael took another sip of the champagne, completely unfazed. "It's delicious," he said casually. Julia kept her gaze fixed on Helen, her mind racing. She didn't know for sure what was going on, but she was certain now that something had been planned, something malicious. This wasn't just a coincidence. The tension in the room gradually eased, and the atmosphere returned to normal. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she had just narrowly escaped something far worse. The night was far from over, and Julia's mind was spinning. She couldn't help but wonder what her mother-in-law and sister-in-law had been planning all along. The wedding reception continued, but for Julia, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Despite her best efforts to remain composed, her mind raced. Helen's frantic reaction when Michael had sipped the champagne was burned into her memory. She knew that something had been off, that something dark had been lurking just beneath the surface of the Hamilton family's glittering facade. Yet, she remained silent, her suspicion growing stronger with each passing moment. As the night wore on, Julia kept a quiet watch on her mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Their anxious glances at her were almost impossible to ignore. But Julia didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Michael, blissfully unaware of the depth of his family's hostility, continued to chat with distant relatives and friends. oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Julia excused herself for a moment and slipped outside. Stepping into the cool night air, she walked along the hotel's pristine courtyard, trying to steady her thoughts. A sense of foreboding still lingered within her, but she reminded herself that she had made it through the worst of the evening without incident. Michael had been fine, and that was all that mattered. A few minutes later, Julia returned to the venue and was greeted by Michael's warm smile. He took her hand gently, his expression filled with a quiet concern. "You okay?" he asked softly. Julia nodded, her smile tight. "I'm fine, just needed a bit of fresh air." "Patrick, Michael," she reminded herself, looked at her with a trace of worry but didn't press the matter further. As the evening began to wind down, Julia found herself feeling oddly detached from the event. The bright lights, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt so distant. As if she were floating above the festivities. She longed for the day to end, to escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to the Hamilton family. Finally, they left. Michael drove them home, and Julia tried to push the unsettling thoughts from her mind, telling herself that tomorrow was another day. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that she had come closer to understanding the depths of her mother-in-law's animosity. Back at their apartment, Julia and Michael collapsed onto the couch, their bodies exhausted but their minds still alert. Michael wrapped his arm around her shoulder, pulling her close. "I know tonight wasn't easy for you," he said, his voice gentle, "but we're okay, I promise." Julia leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. She loved him deeply, but the weight of everything that had happened tonight was still heavy on her heart. "I know," she murmured, "but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. I feel like they've been planning something dangerous." Michael frowned, his face tightening. "What do you mean?" Julia hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "I'm not sure yet, but I think your mother had something to do with it. I've noticed strange things lately, things that don't make sense." Michael didn't respond immediately, his brow furrowed in thought. "I'll talk to her. I'll ask her about it." Julia shook her head, her expression softening. "You don't have to. I don't want to cause more tension. I need to be sure. Something about that champagne. I don't know, but my instincts tell me something's off." Michael nodded, the understanding in his eyes clear. "I trust you, Julia. You've always had incredible instincts. If you think something's wrong, we'll figure it out together." The conversation drifted into silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Julia's mind kept returning to the events of the evening, to the strange, almost frantic reaction from Helen when Michael drank from the glass. She had seen something in her mother-in-law's eyes, something that confirmed her worst fears. The next morning, Julia woke up early, her mind already racing. She needed to get to the hospital, to the lab, to have the champagne tested. She couldn't wait any longer. Her instincts told her that they were dealing with something serious. She had already sent a message to her colleague, Jennifer, asking for her help with a toxin screening. She trusted Jennifer completely, and she knew that if there was something in that glass, Jennifer would be able to find it. By mid-morning, Julia arrived at the hospital's lab. Jennifer was waiting for her, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a serious expression when she saw Julia's face. Without a word, Julia handed over the small vial containing the champagne sample she had discreetly collected the night before. "Can you test it for toxins?" Julia asked, her voice low and urgent. Jennifer nodded without hesitation, her professional instincts kicking in. "I'll get on it right away. Don't worry, Julia. I'll let you know as soon as I have results." Hours passed in a blur as Julia tried to focus on her work. But she couldn't shake the tension in her chest. She knew the answer was coming soon. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. Had she overreacted? Was she imagining things? Finally, just before lunch, Jennifer called. "Julia, you need to come to the lab. Now." Julia's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the lab. She found Jennifer standing over a computer screen, her expression grim. "Look at this," Jennifer said, pointing to the results. Julia leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. The analysis was clear. Traces of atropine had been found in the champagne. A small amount, but dangerous enough to cause harm. Julia's hands shook as she absorbed the information. It wasn't just her intuition. There had been something deliberately placed in that drink. It wasn't a mistake. It was an act of malice. She felt a cold sense of determination wash over her. This was no longer just a hunch. They had the evidence. Now, the truth would come to light. As the sun began to set, Julia and Michael sat side by side on their living room couch. The weight of the past few days still hanging in the air. The confrontation with Michael's mother and sister had been both harrowing and enlightening. Julia had been calm, resolute, as they had presented the evidence of the poisoning attempt. Michael had been furious, heartbroken to realize the lengths to which his family had gone to separate them. Yet, despite the emotional storm, Julia's unwavering love and trust in Michael had been their strength. The following morning, they made their way to Helen's mansion, armed with the test results. When they had laid it all out for her, the shock and disbelief on Helen's face were palpable. Her fragile mask of composure shattered, and she finally admitted what had been brewing beneath her polite exterior for years. She had never accepted Julia because of her background. Because she came from a lesser family, and because she believed Michael deserved someone from a higher social class. The pain of those words stung, but Julia stood strong, determined to move forward and leave the past behind. "You don't have to forgive them," Michael had whispered as they left the mansion, holding Julia's hand tightly. "I'll make sure they face the consequences. We're moving on from this." Julia smiled softly, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. "We don't need them anymore, Michael. We have each other, and that's enough." As they walked out into the bright sunshine, a sense of peace settled between them. They were free from the toxicity of the past, free to build their future together. Julia and Michael were ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that their love, trust, and determination would always see them through. Thank you for reading this story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories and inspiring tales.